Vivian Harrow stood in my driveway with her arms crossed, and 3 private security guards fanned out behind her, smiling like the land already belonged to her. "You don't scare me," she said, then gave the order to pull the lock off my gate. I didn't step forward, didn't raise my voice. I just told them they were standing on private property. Vivien curled the corner of her mouth and called me an unemployed guy playing soldier. But the guard standing beside her glanced over at my mailbox. His face changed. He leaned down and whispered, "Ma'am, he's a Navy SEAL." The property came to me through a long chain of quiet decisions. I had spent enough years in environments where patience wasn't optional, where waiting, watching, and understanding the ground beneath your feet was the difference between a good outcome and a bad one. So when I came home and decided I wanted land, I took my time and looked carefully. I'd never been a person who made large decisions in a hurry, and I wasn't going to start with something as permanent as the ground I'd live on. I found a farmhouse sitting on just under 9 acres in a county most people drove through rather than stopped in, about 20 minutes from the coast, with a tree line on the eastern edge and a gravel road cutting through the northern boundary. The house needed work, but it was solid. Good bones, the way older structures sometimes are when the people who built them weren't in a hurry either. I didn't need much from it. I needed quiet, space, and something that was genuinely mine. What I hadn't fully registered on my first walkthrough was the neighborhood that had grown up right next to my parcel over the previous decade. Briar Glen Estates sat on the other side of a wooden fence line, a planned community of high-end homes, manicured common areas, and the kind of careful landscaping that announces money before you even see the houses themselves. The farmhouse had predated all of it. My parcel existed before Briar Glen was drawn on any map, before a single foundation was poured, before the Homeowners Association was incorporated and given a name and a president. My land was its own thing, unattached, with its own deed and its own county parcel number that had never overlapped with theirs by so much as a surveyor's line. The gravel road along my northern boundary connected the county road out front to a service area behind Briar Glen. The previous owner of my farmhouse had given a verbal allowance for construction traffic during the years the neighborhood was being built. Nothing signed, nothing recorded at the county, just a neighborly understanding that the HOA had quietly treated as something permanent. After I moved in, the trucks kept coming. HOA maintenance vehicles, landscaping crews, once a full commercial rig hauling equipment that left deep ruts in the road surface and a bag of trash at the far end of the property. I watched it for a few weeks, not angry but calculating the cost of resurfacing that stretch if the traffic continued. The number wasn't trivial, so I put up a gate, a standard farm gate with a combination lock, set back entirely on my land, with a sign reading private property and my parcel number stenciled below it in plain black letters. I figured that would start a conversation. It started something else entirely. I spent the first couple of weeks doing what I usually do in a new place, learning it. The land had its own rhythms, the way all land does if you pay attention. The way the morning fog moved off the eastern tree line, the way water collected at one low corner of the northern field after rain. Small things, the kind you only notice by being quiet enough to let them tell you. The neighborhood next door was a different kind of study. Briar Glen operated with a visible sense of order. The lawns maintained to a consistent height, the common areas refreshed seasonally, the entrance monument lit at night with soft landscape lighting. It was a neighborhood that had decided what it wanted to look like and spent considerable money making sure it stayed that way. I had no quarrel with that. What I began to notice once my gate was up was how quickly that sense of order extended to the assumption that everything nearby, including property that had existed long before Briar Glen had a name, was simply part of the territory the HOA managed. The very next morning, Vivian Harrow pulled into my driveway in a white SUV and stepped out like she was arriving at a deposition she'd already won. She looked at my truck, a 12-year-old pickup I'd driven for most of my adult life, and then at my work jacket, faded from real use, and she asked me the question that told me everything I needed to know about who I was dealing with. "Are you renting this place?" I told her no. I owned it. She almost laughed. She informed me that the road had been used by Briar Glen for years, and that my gate was a violation of what she called established access. I asked for the recorded easement. She didn't pause for a single second before answering, "I don't need to prove my HOA's existence to you." The next morning there was a red notice zip-tied to my gate, "HOA violation, $500 per day." I stood looking at it for a long moment, then went back inside. There was just one fairly simple problem with everything that had happened in the last 48 hours. I wasn't a member of the homeowners association. I went to the HOA office the following week with my deed and the county parcel map, the kind of documents that are about as close to incontrovertible as anything gets in a property dispute. The office was in a converted common building near Briar Glen's front entrance, clean floors, tasteful furniture, and a receptionist who looked nervous from the moment I walked in. Vivien was already seated at the long table inside, and when I set my papers down, she glanced at them for about 10 seconds before placing them aside. Not to read later, just aside, like documents she'd already decided were irrelevant to whatever she'd planned to say. Then she began talking. She called me Mr. Danner, the new guy, 3 separate times in the span of about 4 minutes. She referenced my being outside Briar Glen's perimeter twice in a tone that suggested she found it quietly amusing. She said, more than once, that I clearly didn't understand how Briar Glen operated. And then she pushed a thick folder across the table toward me. A stack of violation notices covering everything from my gate not being HOA approved, to my truck being visible from the main road, to my fence not matching what she called the community's established color palette, to my property signs being non-compliant with community standards. I went through them one at a time, calmly. Every single item on that list was a regulation written specifically for properties inside the HOA's jurisdiction. My parcel had never been annexed into Briar Glen. Applying those rules to my land was like citing me for a traffic violation on a road that didn't exist in my county. I didn't say any of that aloud. I just asked one question. Are you certain you want to formally document that the HOA is applying its regulations to my parcel? Vivien looked at me the way people look at someone who said something they consider either funny or foolish, and she couldn't quite decide which. Do you think speaking slowly and looking intense is going to frighten me? I picked up my documents and left. From my years of service, I had absorbed one principle that turned out to be useful in a surprising number of civilian situations. When someone wants you to react emotionally, the correct response is to collect information first. So I went home and I started building a file. I mounted a camera facing the gate and the driveway entrance. I kept every piece of mail the HOA sent. I printed copies of every email, saved voicemails, and pulled the full property records from the county assessor's office. I cross-referenced them with the original Briar Glen subdivision plat and laid everything across my kitchen table in chronological order. I wasn't looking for a confrontation. I was making sure that if one came to me, I'd be standing on ground I completely understood. I had learned a long time ago that the most important documentation is usually the kind done before you need it. People who wait until a dispute has already escalated to start keeping records are always playing catch-up. I wasn't going to play catch-up. Every piece of paper the HOA sent me went into a folder with a date stamped on it. Every email thread was printed in full with headers intact. I kept a handwritten log of every vehicle I observed using the road on my property, with timestamps and descriptions. I noted weather conditions on each date, because road conditions matter when you're building a case about damage. It was methodical and it was quiet, and nobody watching from the Briar Glen side of the fence would have known it was happening. Then I found something. in an older county planning document, the kind that doesn't surface on a basic property search, but is available if you know what to look for. There was a notation on a map running directly through the stretch of road I'd gated off. The notation wasn't labeled existing easement. It wasn't labeled recorded access or community property. It was labeled something specific and very different from what Vivien had been telling everyone around her. The words on that map read, "Proposed secondary emergency access, not active, not granted. Not documented in any deed or recorded instrument of any kind. Proposed." I sat with that word for a while. It meant the road through my land wasn't an established right the HOA was defending. It was something someone had assumed they could eventually acquire, and that assumption, I was beginning to understand, sat at the dead center of everything Vivian Harrow had been doing since the morning I put up my gate. The county planning office was a 40-minute drive, housed in a beige building near the civic center with fluorescent lighting and the particular quiet that government spaces have on weekday mornings. I asked for Elena Brooks, whose name appeared on several of the planning documents I'd pulled, and she came out from the back with a mug of coffee and a composed professional expression that shifted slightly when I spread out the materials I'd brought. She didn't rush. She pulled the official files without being prompted, set them on the counter between us, and walked through them in careful sequence. Briar Glen Estates had been growing in phases since its original approval. Phase 1 had been completed years before I arrived, and there were fully drawn plans for Phase 2. A significant expansion that would add a substantial number of high-end homes to the community's eastern boundary. The project had been designed, the lots laid out, the financial commitments made, the pre-sale marketing already underway. But there was a condition attached to Phase 2's approval that had not been resolved. To receive final occupancy certification for an expansion of that scale, the development needed a secondary emergency egress, a second route in and out for fire trucks, ambulances, and evacuation traffic that didn't share the single entrance with Phase 1. The plan documents showed that route running directly through the gravel road on my property. I asked Elena if there was a recorded easement. She looked at her screen. She looked at the physical file. Then she looked at me without answering right away, which was itself an answer. There was no recorded easement. The temporary construction access the previous farmhouse owner had allowed had a stated expiration date. That date had passed. No subsequent agreement had been executed. No permanent easement existed in the county's records. And then Elena pointed to something else. A document filed with the county several months before I'd moved in. A certification statement attached to the Phase 2 permit application, stating in plain language that secondary emergency access was being secured through existing community rights. Existing community rights that did not exist anywhere in any recorded document. I drove home understanding the full shape of what I was dealing with. Vivien hadn't been coming after me because I'd put up a gate she found inconvenient. She'd been coming after me because Phase 2 of Briar Glen's expansion, with its contractor commitments, its pre-sale valuations, and Vivien's own reputation as the woman who had made all of it happen, depended entirely on that road. Without a legal right to use it, the project had a problem that couldn't be papered over, and someone had already told the county the problem was solved. So the fines, the violation notices, the pressure, none of it was about HOA policy. It was about forcing me to surrender before I figured out what I was actually holding. When I pulled up to my house that afternoon, a black SUV was parked across from my gate. Vivien stood beside it. She hadn't come alone. 3 private security guards were positioned behind her, and the man closest to her stood with the particular stillness that comes from training rather than from size, tracking my movement as I climbed out of the truck the way you track movement when the stakes are high enough to matter. His name was Reed Calloway. He had served as a master-at-arms in the Navy And the reason he was watching me with that specific quality of attention was that somewhere in the back of his memory, he already knew my name. Vivien didn't wait for me to reach the gate before she started talking. She announced that the HOA was exercising what she called its right to restore emergency access, and that the gate would be removed that afternoon. She said it with the certainty of someone who had never given an order like that and been told no. I stopped about 15 feet from her and stood there. "Nobody touches that gate," I said. She took 2 steps toward me and looked me over. The old truck, the faded jacket, the fact that I hadn't dressed up for the occasion, which I imagine was supposed to tell her something about my relative leverage in the situation. Then she said something that caught me slightly off guard, not because it stung, but because it told me she'd been doing research. "This isn't a base," she said. "You can't give orders to other people just because you used to wear a uniform." She'd found something in public veteran records, enough to know I'd served, not nearly enough to know where or in what capacity. She'd decided that information was more useful as a punchline than as something that warranted caution. "You don't scare me," she said. I looked at her for a moment. "I've never tried to scare you," I told her. She turned to Reed and gave the order to remove the lock. He didn't move. He was looking at my mailbox, a plain metal box with standard stick-on letters, DANNER. He was reading my name with an expression I recognized, the expression of someone matching a face to something they already know. Reed had served a security rotation at a facility connected to naval special warfare. He hadn't known me personally, but he knew what that name meant and where it came from. He turned to Vivien and lowered his voice to something close to a murmur. "Ma'am," he said, "he's a Navy SEAL." The 2 guards flanking her both stopped. Vivien went very still, not frightened but recalibrating, the way someone does when the ground shifts beneath a plan they assumed was solid. I didn't press the moment. That matters. I didn't stand straighter or let satisfaction into my voice, because this had nothing to do with my military background. "Former," I said, "and it has no bearing on the fact that you're standing on my land." She recovered quickly. I will give her that consistently. Vivian Harrow had not gotten to where she was by losing her composure for long. She straightened and said, very deliberately, "I don't care what you used to be." Structurally, that was the right answer. My background wasn't the issue and had never been the issue. "Good," I told her. "Then let's talk about the deed." She reached for her phone instead. She informed me we weren't going to discuss the deed. We were going to talk to law enforcement. She dialed 911 right there in my driveway, looking at me while she did it, waiting for a reaction she expected and didn't get. I waited. I was not worried about a deputy arriving. I had my documents. I had my gate camera. I had a clear understanding of what a civil property dispute looked like versus what a criminal matter looked like, and nothing that had happened in my driveway came anywhere close to the second category. What I noticed, while Vivien was on the phone, was that Reed Calloway had moved slightly apart from her guards. He stood with his arms at his sides, eyes in the middle distance, doing quiet arithmetic that people do when the situation has turned out to be significantly different from what they were briefed on. I'd seen that posture before. It always meant the person doing the math had already reached the answer, and the answer wasn't what anyone who hired them had hoped for. Deputy Mason Reddick arrived about 12 minutes later in a county cruiser, stepped out without urgency, and assessed the scene with the practiced neutrality of someone who had responded to enough property disputes to know that the loudest person rarely had the stronger legal position. Vivien met him at the driveway edge and began her account immediately, and I let her go. She described me as a confrontational veteran who was illegally blocking community emergency access, who had refused to cooperate with reasonable HOA requests, and who had created a dangerous situation by denying the neighborhood its fire egress. She was thorough and fluent and delivered the whole account with the confidence of someone accustomed to being believed. Mason listened without interrupting. Then he asked one question. How did he threaten you? Vivien paused. He's been obstructing us. Mason asked again more precisely. What specific action or statement would you characterize as a threat? She mentioned my military background. Mason glanced over at me, still standing by the gate, hands at my sides, exactly where I'd been the entire time, then looked back at her. Has he moved toward you at any point? The camera above my gate could answer that with a timestamp, and Vivien seemed to sense that, because she shifted her approach. Mason walked over to me. I gave him the deed and the parcel map with the county records reference. He looked at both carefully, which I respected. He then walked back to Vivien and asked to see her documentation of the easement. She gave him an HOA letterhead document citing community access rights in general language. Mason held the two sets of papers side by side long enough that the difference between a recorded county deed and an internal HOA letter became apparent to everyone watching. He told Vivien plainly that this was a civil dispute over property access rights, that no criminal conduct had occurred, and that no party on either side was legally authorized to remove or damage the other's property while access rights remained unresolved. Vivien asked if he understood what was at stake for the community. Mason said he understood what the law said. She turned to Reed. What am I paying you for? Reed had been standing apart from her guards for several minutes. His answer came without hesitation. To protect people and property, he said. Not to damage someone else's. That landed the way a door closing in a quiet room lands. Not dramatic, just definitive. Vivien's jaw tightened. She said something to Reed I didn't catch, then walked to the SUV. Before getting in, she turned and pointed at me with one controlled finger. You're going to regret choosing this fight. I told her I hadn't chosen it. She left without responding to that. By evening, I had an email requiring my attendance at an emergency HOA board meeting 3 days later. Grant Hollowell, the HOA's retained attorney, was copied on it. Grant was experienced and practical. A real estate and community law attorney who had handled easement work and subdivision agreements across the county for many years. The fact that he was being brought into the room told me something. Either Vivien had escalated beyond what she could manage alone, or she was using legal presence the way people use expensive furniture to signal authority before anyone has said a word. What she hadn't accounted for was that bringing in a competent attorney meant bringing someone whose professional obligations required knowing what documents actually existed and what didn't. I spent those 3 days preparing the way I'd prepare for any briefing where the outcome depended on having better information than the person across the table. I organized everything chronologically, printed the phase, 2 permit certification, circled the word proposed on the planning notation, and laid it all inside a single manila folder in the order I would present it. I thought carefully about sequence. It wasn't enough to have the right documents. The order in which you present information determines how a room processes it. You want to establish foundation before you reveal contradiction. You want the audience to understand what should have existed before you show them that it doesn't. I had been in enough briefings where the information was correct, but the sequencing was wrong and the point got lost in the confusion. I wasn't going to let that happen here. I wasn't going to be loud in that room. I was going to be accurate, and I was going to be patient, and I was going to let the documents do what documents do when they're telling the truth, and the story they're contradicting is made of something considerably thinner. 3 days before the meeting, Vivien sent a written notice to every resident of Briar Glen. I received a copy which I believe was intentional. She wanted me to see it. The notice described the situation at the eastern boundary as a community safety matter, stated that an uncooperative property owner was blocking the designated secondary emergency route, referenced what she called threatening behavior from someone she described only as a non-community property holder. and framed Phase 2 as being in jeopardy due to one individual's refusal to honor long-standing access agreements. It was a carefully constructed document. If you didn't know the facts, it read as entirely reasonable. If you did know them, it was a masterwork of selective omission. Every phrase technically arguable, the overall picture completely misleading. The effect was precisely what she'd calculated. Some residents became vocal. I received 2 handwritten notes in my mailbox informing me that I was being selfish and dangerous, and that children lived in Briar Glen, and that I needed to consider that. I read both and added them to my file. I didn't respond publicly. The instinct to defend yourself when someone is misrepresenting you in front of a crowd is powerful and almost always counterproductive. I'd learned in environments where misrepresenting an adversary's intent was a deliberate tactical tool that the correct response was never to argue louder. It was to let the record build itself. I sent 3 written questions to Grant Hollowell, simple enough that answering them should have taken less than a minute if the answers were straightforward. First, was my parcel formally annexed into the HOA's jurisdiction? Second, was there a recorded easement for road access on file with the county? Third, who had signed the certification statement submitted to the county declaring that secondary emergency access had already been secured? I sent these at 9 in the morning and received no reply that day. The following afternoon, something revealing happened. Grant sent a separate communication to Vivien, which Tessa Whitlock later showed me, advising her to have no further direct contact with me before the board meeting. That meant Grant had looked into my 3 questions and found answers he didn't like. Vivien didn't follow the advice. She sent a final demand letter compiling every violation notice she'd issued into a running total that now represented a substantial sum, all of it based on regulations that had never applied to my parcel. She was still pressing, still trying to generate enough financial and legal noise to force a quick settlement before the board meeting could surface the real problem. I recognized the tactic. When you can't win on the merits, you try to make the cost of continuing feel prohibitive. The difference in this case was that I was not in a hurry, and I had done my homework. Tessa Whitlock called me 2 days before the meeting. She introduced herself as the HOA's vice president, told me she'd been watching the situation develop with growing unease, and was careful in what she shared, still a board member, not fully certain how far she was willing to go. But she told me 2 things that mattered. The first was that Vivien had told the board privately that I would back down before any meeting happened, using the exact phrase that people like me always yielded when lawyers showed up. The second was that Vivien had notified the Phase 2 developer directly that the emergency access issue was no longer an obstacle, not under review, not being resolved, no longer an obstacle. No easement, no agreement, no documentation, just her word delivered as settled fact. Before hanging up, Tessa sent me a photograph of a page from an internal board memo. At the bottom, below a discussion of Phase 2's construction timeline, was a single line in the meeting minutes. President Harrow authorized to certify access on behalf of the board. I printed that page and added it to my folder. Vivien hadn't simply made a mistake in a neighborhood dispute. She had made a formal representation to the county on behalf of a board that either hadn't understood or hadn't been told what they were authorizing. And the document that representation was attached to was part of a permit application for a multi-million-dollar real estate development. That wasn't a homeowners association policy problem. It was a liability exposure of a fundamentally different category. The meeting room was full. Vivien had made sure of that. Enough word had gone out to residents that the space was standing room by the time I arrived. I found a seat near the end of the table, set the folder down, and waited. Grant Hollowell was seated to one side with a legal pad and the expression of an attorney who has arrived knowing something uncomfortable is about to become part of the official record. Reed Calloway was seated near the door. Grant had requested that Reed's company submit a formal incident report from the confrontation at my gate, and Reed had filed one that afternoon. I didn't know its exact contents, but the fact that Grant had requested it told me the attorney was trying to understand precisely what had occurred versus what his own client had told him. Vivien opened the meeting, and she was polished. I will give her that. She framed the situation in the language she'd been using for weeks. Community safety, property rights, Phase 2's importance to Briar Glen's future, and the value of every home in the development. She referenced my military background once more, this time more carefully. Not mocking it, but using it to suggest the confrontation at my gate had carried an inherently threatening quality. His background doesn't place him above the rules that govern this community, she said. I waited until she was entirely finished. I agree completely, I said. The room shifted slightly. It wasn't what people had been expecting. Vivien had prepared for an argument, and I had declined to give her one. I'm not here to argue that my background entitles me to anything, I continued. I'd like to go through some documents. The first document was my deed with the legal description of my property boundaries. I noted for the record that my parcel had never been annexed into Briar Glen Estates, that I had never signed an HOA agreement, and that the violation notices I'd received cited regulations that applied exclusively to properties within the HOA's recorded jurisdiction. Every fine Vivien had issued against me was legally unenforceable from the first day it was written. She started to speak. I asked her to let me finish. The second document was the temporary construction access authorization from the previous owner of my farmhouse, with its expiration date clearly visible. The authorization had been granted for the duration of Briar Glen's construction phase. That phase had ended. The authorization had expired. No subsequent agreement had been executed, and no permanent easement had been recorded at the county. Continued use of the road after that expiration had not created any legal right of access under the applicable statutes governing this type of property situation in this state. The third document was the county planning record. I placed it on the table facing the board members so they could all read it. I pointed to the notation, "Proposed Secondary Emergency Access." I said the word "proposed" once and let it sit in the room for a moment. The fourth document was the Phase 2 permit application. Turn to the certification page. This certification states that secondary emergency access has already been secured. This planning record states that the access route is proposed, not existing, not recorded, without any easement attached to it. I looked at Vivien. These two documents cannot both be true at the same time. The fifth document was the board memo Tessa had photographed. I had a clean printed copy and I placed it on the table facing the room. The line at the bottom, "President Harrow authorized to certify access on behalf of the board," was visible to everyone present. Tessa was 2 seats from Vivien, and I watched her jaw tighten as she read it in that context, because seeing it on a meeting table in front of witnesses meant something different from seeing it on a phone screen in private. Tessa asked, clearly and directly, whether the HOA had a recorded easement for the road on my property. Vivien said the matter was complicated and that documentation was being reviewed. Grant Hollowell said, in the flat, measured tone of someone who had decided candor was now the least dangerous available option, "No." One word, the kind of word that, once spoken in front of a room full of witnesses with a legal pad on the table, cannot be unspoken. Vivien pivoted. She accused me of knowing all along what the road was worth to Phase 2 and using it as leverage. She used the word extortion. I picked up my phone and displayed the first email I had ever sent to the HOA on the wall screen behind the table. It read, "Please provide the recorded easement you believe grants access to the road running through my parcel." The entire email, no demands, no financial conditions, no threats, one question about a document. Reed, when called upon for his incident report, confirmed that at no point during the gate confrontation had I made any demand for payment. issued any threat, or done anything beyond clearly stating that the gate stood on private property and that no one should touch it. Vivien turned to him. "Whose side are you on?" Reed said, quietly and without any heat at all. "I'm on the side of what happened." Tessa closed the folder in front of her, looked down the table at the other board members, and moved to immediately suspend Vivian Harrow from the HOA presidency, pending a full review of the Phase 2 documentation and the certification submitted to the county. The vote went against Vivien clearly and quickly. Vivien didn't go quietly, but she also didn't go credibly. She said the things people say when the room has already made up its mind, that Briar Glen would collapse without her leadership, that the board was too short-sighted to understand what she had built, that the community would suffer consequences for this decision. Some of it came out louder than she'd probably intended. Grant wrote nothing down. The security staff stood against the walls. Nobody argued. Nobody moved toward her. And that, I think, was what finally reached her. Not the vote itself, which had been clean and decisive, but the absence of anyone in the room who still looked to her to know what to do next. The room had reorganized itself around a different center, and there was nothing she could do to pull it back. All violation notices and fines issued against my parcel were voided. Grant told the board, in language careful enough to signal he was already calculating liability exposure, that the HOA needed to formally notify the county planning office, the Phase 2 developer, the project's insurance counsel, and every party that had relied on Vivien's certification. The process of correcting that documentation would not be fast or cheap, but it was necessary. And Grant had made peace with that in the hours since I'd sent him 3 simple questions. After the meeting closed and the room began to empty, Vivien found me in the parking lot. She was alone. No guards, no board members, no attorney beside her. Just her and the gap between who she'd been when she first drove up to my gate and who she was now. She asked if I was satisfied. There was something underneath the question, not quite pain, more like the particular flatness that settles in when something built over years needs to be reconstructed from the floor up. I told her the truth. "I just wanted you to stop using my road as though it belonged to you." She said I could have destroyed the entire community over a gravel road, and I could hear that she genuinely believed it, that she had organized her whole understanding of the situation around the idea that the road itself was the cause of the problem, rather than the place where a problem she had created finally became impossible to hide. I thought about that for a moment before answering. "No," I said. "I locked my gate. Everything after that was decisions you made." She had no answer for that. Not because she was incapable of arguing, she was skilled at arguing, but because the argument simply wasn't there to be made. Every step that had led to that parking lot had been a choice she'd made freely, from a position of assumed authority, and every one of those choices had become part of a record that would outlast the afternoon it was made. I left her there and drove home the long way, because the evening was clear and I wasn't in any hurry. I have thought about that conversation in the parking lot more than I expected to. Not with regret or satisfaction, but with a kind of clarity that only comes when something has been resolved completely. The thing about Vivien was that she had never actually been wrong about the road's value. She'd been right about that from the beginning. The road through my property was genuinely critical to what she'd been building. What she'd been wrong about was everything else. The idea that I was the kind of person who could be pressured into giving something away before I understood its worth. The idea that a violation notice could substitute for a legal instrument. The idea that the moment she invoked institutional authority, the other person in the room would simply fold. She had built her entire strategy on assumptions about who I was, and she'd made every one of those assumptions before she'd learned anything about me at all. The formal easement negotiation began about 3 weeks later, initiated by Tessa Whitlock in her capacity as acting president. She approached it directly. The community genuinely needed that access route for Phase 2 to proceed, and she wanted to do it correctly this time. I had no interest in punishing Briar Glen for Vivian's choices. The neighborhood was full of ordinary people who had bought homes and raised families and had no more personal involvement in Vivian's decisions than I did. So I agreed to negotiate, and the terms I outlined weren't punitive. They were simply precise. The HOA would pay for all road improvements and any future resurfacing required by increased use. The easement would be narrowly defined to emergency and authorized maintenance access only, with no general HOA vehicle traffic. The HOA would assume full liability for any damage caused by their use of the road. My ownership of the parcel would remain entirely unchanged, and no HOA rule, regulation, fine, or authority of any kind would apply to my property or structures at any future point. That clause written directly into the easement agreement itself. The HOA's attorney accepted every condition. Phase 2 was delayed by several months, but was not canceled. The developer was more relieved that the documentation issue had been corrected than he was troubled by the delay, because the alternative, having the false certification surface during construction or after occupancy, would have been considerably worse for everyone involved. Vivien resigned completely before the internal review concluded. On the morning the easement was signed and recorded at the county, Reed Calloway was standing outside the gate when I came out to check the mailbox. He'd been brought on by the HOA's new management for community security, a different arrangement than before, and by the look of it, a more straightforward one. He said he wanted to apologize for having shown up at my gate alongside Vivien the way he had that first afternoon. I told him there was nothing to apologize for. He'd read the situation correctly from the moment it mattered and acted accordingly. He seemed like he still needed to say it, so I let him finish. He smiled after a moment. I still remember the look on her face when I told her she was dealing with a Navy SEAL. I looked out at the gate, the road, the tree line at the far end of the property. Funny thing is, I said, that part didn't actually matter. He understood without needing it explained. I hadn't won anything because of what I'd done in the military. I hadn't won it with size or volume or with the kind of presence that makes a room go quiet. I'd won it because when Vivien had wanted me to react, I'd collected documents instead. When she'd tried to pressure me, I'd asked questions. When she'd used her title and her authority, I'd used recorded evidence and county records. When she'd told her board I would back down the moment lawyers showed up, I'd shown up with a folder, and when she'd stood in my own driveway and told me I didn't scare her, she had been completely right. I had never needed her to be afraid. I had only needed her to keep talking. Because every sentence Vivian Harrow spoke from a position of certainty she didn't actually possess, was another sentence added quietly and patiently to a record that was building itself against her. And that record, precise, thorough, and entirely indifferent to her opinion of me, was the only thing that had ever really mattered from the very beginning.